Hello, welcome. So today I'd like to do something a little bit new, a little bit different. I'd like to run through the recent UK Channel 4 interview with Jordan Peterson because it was just absolutely ripe with just problems so indicative of the divide between the modern, right and left, and variations even within the left, variations within the right, just issues on like gender equality, equality of opportunity, equality of outcome. The whole thing was just like it was absolute cancer from the side of the perspective of the interviewer. So with that said, let's look at some clips and do some analysis.
You say there are whole disciplines in universities forthrightly hostile towards men. These are the areas of study dominated by the postmodern stroke neo-Marxist claim that Western culture in particular is an oppressive structure created by white men to dominate and exclude women. But then I want to put
minorities too.
All right, so wow. So to break into that right from the beginning, I've sort of outlined the main features of this just to sort of reason through it all. So right at the beginning, we have the conversation contextualized by this notion of postmodernism and how postmodernism has more or less come to dominate universities and political ideological thought, which myself, being a graduate student in university, I can absolutely vouch for in my classrooms. So to sort of break that down, it's that modernism, or the modern era, was the period at which science really started to develop rationality, objectivity, empiricism came to dominate science, become science, and that sort of penetrated through universities and through life, etc. But over time, as we move into the postmodern period, some thinkers in universities, particularly left-wing thinkers, have come to take aim at the notions of objectivity and of rationality as purely male enacted features or purely male enacted features that are male, which are enacted with the purpose of preserving male interest and sort of dictating the world that we see and interact with as seen and interacted with from the male perspective, and that this male perspective in turn serves to subjugate and keep women at a lesser position. So what you're seeing, and from me, for example, I'm a graduate student in university in a heavily leftist department, and for example, one of the things we learned in our research methods class, which is like a mandatory course that the graduate students have to take to learn about how to properly conduct research, etc., was that, I kid you not, this is a real thing. They take complete stabs at logical positivism, at objectivity and rationality, and they say that essentially that no science is free of subjectivity, that there is no such thing as pure objectivity, there are no absolute claims, it is just simply construction, social construction. And then that social construction has served the male interest rather than the female interest. And oh my god, let me tell you, the first time I encountered that ideology, I was in my second year of undergraduate studies in university in philosophy of science, and we were studying one dimension of the course was feminist philosophy of science, and we were studying this one geneticist, and we were just reviewing some of her work, and she was doing genetic modifications on corn to make corn cannot remember what the hell the purpose was, but what the reading focused on was how she, as a feminist philosopher of science, incorporated feminine behaviors and attributes into her science to sort of, fight the patriarchy. And basically how she did that is in her discussions about the corn, she referred to treating the corn as if she loved it, as if displaying care for the corn. Like, it was very centralized on these notions of care and love and compassion, and it was like one of the most absurd things that I have ever had to endure. And I endured a similar kind of ideology when I took philosophy of feminism in my fourth year of university, in which and this could be a whole video in itself, but where they deconstruct again rationality, objectivity as male enacted features, or a male enacted lens to look at the world through, which sort of reinforces masculinity and the sort of centrality of maleness. And it's like, You're so dumb.
Simple question. Is gender equality a myth in your view? Is that something that's just never going to happen?
It depends on what you mean by equality. You know,
Being
if you
treated
mean that
fairly,
men and women
getting
are
the same opportunities?
fairly, we could get to a point where people were treated fairly or more fairly. I mean, people are treated pretty fairly in Western culture already, but we could
Well, they're
improve
really
that.
not, though, are they? I mean,
With that contextualization of, male-dominated patriarchy, we move into the gender pay gap. So, she states that there is a 9% pay gap between men and women in the UK and, can be broadly construed across. And what she's arguing is that because it exists, it's unfair. And Peterson's response to that is, no, what you're saying, or what the interview is saying, is she's trying to say that because there is a gap, that gap necessarily means sexism, it means gender discrimination, and therefore it's completely unfair. And Peterson's response is, well, no, because you're talking in terms of like univariance. You're not talking about multivariate analysis, which has been done and shows that the pay gap between men and women is not solely due to gender, just gender discrimination. Yes, a small portion of it may be due to that, or appears like it would be due to that, but the entirety of it is not. And it's like, it just can't quite penetrate her, dense feminist skull. She's like, but it's unfair. But it's unfair. So no, it's not unfair, because as Jordan Peterson was saying, a multivariate analysis is something which looks at all of the different dimensions of a circumstance to determine what degree all of those things are causes, or like what is the actual data surrounding this problem, all of the different things that factor into it, not just one thing. That's what she's doing. She's coming from the side of it's just sexism. When Jordan Peterson says that the multivariate analysis has been done, what he's talking about is, on average, for the same jobs and across different jobs, women on average work less than men. I believe men work an average of 40-something hours per week, and women work an average of 30-something. And further, men and women tend to go into different kinds of fields, and the fields that women go into tend to pay a lot less than men. All you need to do is Google the statistics for yourself or wherever you live for average occupations of men and women, where they're like most densely populated, and they're most densely populated in different fields, and those fields that women are in pay less. So, however, the main example that Peterson gives, he says one of the key point here, one of the dimensions of why that pay gap exists is also the dimension of women tend to be, on average, more agreeable than men. So what that means, more passive, less apt to be combative or aggressive or argue for a wage increase. So that's the personality and assertiveness dimension. And so that's a really interesting dimension. So that's my only criticism of him there, actually, in this interview, is that I wish that he would have hit on the other dimensions of the multivariate analysis rather than just the average personality type. So it's a good point, though. It is, and we will also revisit that point. I want to revisit that when we get back into the objectivity, subjectivity, postmodernism, rationality, female-male behaviors, etc., because that's a rich conversation that ties in really good. But to pull it down, so she asked him, to close this sort of discussion off, she asked him, well, should we eliminate it? And his response is, well, that depends what you mean. Are you, what do you mean when you say that? How can we measure that? Because when we look at the analysis, the pay gap is very complex, right? All of those dimensions. So, why do women prefer to work less? Why do women prefer the fields that they do? Why do these things happen because they're the result of feminine interests? And if we were to forcibly figure out some legislative way to force the pay gap to close by forcing men and women into different positions, etc., well, wouldn't that kind of work against the independent interests of men and women being able to freely choose what they want to do? So, the example he uses in the Scandinavian countries, where they high degree of legislative equality, and what they found is that men and women don't categorize themselves into the same occupations, etc. They have, on average, different interests, and they sort themselves differently. So in that way, equality of outcome is undesirable and kind of impossible, because it goes against letting people freely choose. Just because people choose different things and there exists some difference between those things and a pay difference between those things, that doesn't necessarily mean it's problematic or that we need to somehow, forcibly fix it. Like the example of that the interviewer gives also, she's like, well, there must be sexism because there's only 7 company heads of the top 100 companies in the UK. No. So dimension of that is, if there was so much sexism, why would there even be those 7 to begin with? But also, did you ever think that maybe women just don't want to do that? That maybe the proportion of women that are there are the proportion of women that would like to live that kind of lifestyle. And even Jordan Peterson was saying it's not like every single man is running out to do that, to dedicating 70 to 80 hours a week, giving up your entire life just for the sake of business and profit. So part of the dimension of the average female personality that Jordan Peterson adds in there is that, or maybe I don't think he said in this interview, but he's talked about it in other ones, where females tend to be more rounded. They tend to be more centered around family units, around sort of the personal dimension of life rather than the work dimension of life. And I think that's kind of supported also by the fact that women tend to work less than men. So what he's getting at, or what I'm getting at to summarize him, is that to eliminate it it's not a question that makes sense, because there's no sensible answer to that question. Because in order to do that, to close this gap, you'd be aiming for a complete equality of outcome between men and women, when in fact doing that might be precisely against what men and women actually want for themselves. So it's a nonsensical question. It does not make sense, and she just doesn't get it. So let's dive into some more of that cancer, shall we?
Is it not desirable to have some of those female traits you're talking about? I'd say that's a generalization, but you've used the words female traits. Is it not desirable to have some of them at the top of business? I mean, maybe there wouldn't have
They
been
don't predict
a banking
success.
crisis.
Okay, so now they're moving back into a bit of a back and forth about female traits. So females on average, as Peterson has pointed out, and like by virtue of his clinical research, etc., is that females tend to be more agreeable, higher in the agreeableness spectrum, more compassionate, etc., whereas men are more aggressive, less agreeable, more debative, etc. And so they're sort of talking about why can't female traits be indicative of success? Or why isn't it the case that, or why can't we have an experiment where we have female business owners and we see how successful they are, etc. The sort of back and forth about this. Why can't they be successful? And I really don't think, like, my biggest problem with this discussion is that I don't necessarily think that this comes down to an argument about female and male traits. I think we're talking about specific human traits that tend to be found more on the masculine spectrum, less on the female spectrum, although still sometimes found in the female spectrum. And what those traits are, for example, assertiveness, like not necessarily combativeness, but the willingness to sort of be outright, outspoken, firm, assertive, there in your presence, like a very strong presence of being there. And so men tend to have that more than women. Not that all women don't have it. And I can vouch for this, like, on my own personal level too. So one thing that I always noticed in my undergraduate career, like in philosophy, in classrooms, whenever there's always a difference between when men and women or girls and boys rather would raise their hands to answer questions in class. So men on average, I noticed, tend to be more sort of speak louder, more assertive with what they were saying, more confident in what they were doing and saying. And when women on average raised their hands, they tended to be more passive. They tended to speak with a smaller voice, not to be too outspoken, to be very, like, confined within themselves. And I've even now, as I've escalated to like teaching courses, as like being a TA at the graduate level, so I've taught about 4 courses now. Well, I've taught 2, and I'm in the process of doing another two classes, and I find the exact same thing from the perspective of the teacher now, where when women raise their hands, if they raise their hands, the majority of people who raise their hands are men, even though the proportion of the classroom is more female than men, because there are more women in university now than there are men. But when these women raise their hands to make a point, they speak so softly. Like, I literally have to badger them. I'm like, speak louder. Like, who are you? I can't hear you. I have no idea what you're saying. Why are you speaking so quietly? So, like, I keep noticing that. So if we look at the context of the workplace with these sort of traits that women tend to exhibit, well, why would you be successful if you act like that? Why would someone be overly respectful of, or why would someone be in admiration of, or why would someone value this kind of like meagerness, this sort of demonstration of weakness, of a lack of competence and confidence in yourself? Because put it this way, I think when you overtly appear that you lack confidence, it tends to come off that you overtly might lack competence as well, and that's deeply problematic, and no doubt would be a part of the explanation of gender discrimination. So when we're talking about gender discrimination, I think we're talking about the discrimination of traits, because another example is that there was another TA last semester who was teaching. She had two tutorials that she was teaching, and I know this like offhand, like from what I've heard around from different people, is that she had a lot of problems in the classroom with some of the men in her classroom not really respecting her authority. And the kind of woman that I've observed her, because I've had some classes with her, I'm not friends with her, but I know her, she's very, very feminine. She wears a lot of like very pretty, nice makeup, and she has like long, nice hair, like very attractive, but she's also very, very soft-spoken. And so when I heard about this, that she was not being respected in the class by like having problems with men, like it took me a second to really realize that, well, I've never had any of those problems. Like when I'm teaching in the classroom, I'm not soft-spoken by any means. I'm very assertive with what I'm saying, and I tend to take up a lot of space in the classroom. I tend to walk around, and if someone's talking while I'm talking, I will literally speak assertively and say, "I'm sorry, why are you talking while I'm talking?" And you better believe that no one ever disrespects me in the classroom. Never had that problem. So the reason I bring this up is because I think it shapes what Peterson's saying a lot, is that when you display certain qualities, they're probably not going to be as respected as other qualities. And I think that divide between me and that other TA is a great example of that, because like, should people do that or treat people without respect who seem unconfident? No, you should just be nice, of course. But I'm saying is that it's a lot easier to take advantage of that person than it is, for example, to take advantage of me. Because immediately in that classroom, from the perspective of the student, for example, that if you try to take advantage of the sort of less confident TA, she's not very likely to be assertive with you or aggressive back with you. But if you're going to try and take aim at someone who is very confident, very assertive, you better believe that you're going to be made a relative fool of in that classroom by the person that you're trying to, take down a notch. So this is why I think Peterson's saying that female traits aren't necessarily on average, stereotypical female traits aren't necessarily indicative of success for the exact reasons that I've just outlined. So this brings me back to my initial point, which is I don't think that this necessarily has to be a matter of male versus female in terms of these traits, that these are just valuable human traits. So like, for example, confidence, competence, assertiveness, aggressiveness. These are things that convey a sort of aura of authority or of respectability to people. They say, I'm someone that you will not easily challenge, or I'm someone who can take control of a situation, etc. And we value these things because they're self-evident. They're valuable in themselves. We see that they're effective. And the opposite spectrum of that, we see that they're not as effective and therefore not as valuable. So then we come into a situation where we have, on average, males demonstrating the valuable traits and on average, women demonstrating the non-valuable traits. Well, then what do you think is going to happen? I think that's some justifiable discrimination. For example, like, I'm an employer also. I have a small business. If I were to have two men and I were to have, like, in an interview and have one be, evidently, like, making himself very small, not very confident in what he's doing, and then I have another man who's very confident in what he's doing, making himself large, like, very present, who do you think I'm going to hire? Obviously not the very meager, quiet one. It's not going to happen. And so I think this exact same principle applies to females as well. Why wouldn't it? So if you have two females coming in for an interview, it's exactly the same principle. If one is very, lacks confidence, evidently is very soft-spoken, and you have another one that, sits up straight, is very assertive, not, I don't want to say hard-spoken, but assertive, who do you think is going to get the job? Obviously the one who is competent. So More cancer.
Speech in that. Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like, you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that?
How good did it feel to see her walk into that trap? Good job, Peterson. No, but okay. So really, that was such a good point. That was just bang on, because so often right now we're seeing in sort of political life and university life and general discourse that some things you can't say, or you can't inquire about, or you can't talk about, or you can't have a converse opinion to because it's just too offensive. That your, like, the common transgender or gender fluid claim is that you can't question my desire for you to call me my own gender specific pronouns, because for you to question that is for you to offend me in such a way that violates my personal identity. It's like, well, no, offensiveness and questioning is a part of being human. It's a part of human discourse with each other, which is perfectly made evident by this entire interview of Peterson and this woman, where she's constantly, like, misrepresenting his views, challenging him, criticizing him. Like, she just keeps digging, like, projecting her own opinions onto him and offending the shit out of him, which he seemed to deal with pretty well. But his point is that that's good. You're free to do that. That's what the free speech debate is about. It's about you're free to question me. You're free to offend me. And in turn, I'm free to offend you. Nobody gets special privileges, because debate and free speech and risking being offensive to other people is how we sort of dig down to the bottom of issues and realize what's true and what's false, right? So if you take away people's ability to be offensive to other people, well, then you're taking away our ability to discourse and to debate about issues that are important to all people. Because what's more valuable? Just, passively never questioning anything ever and never getting down to the bottom of anything, or, like, rigorously trying to figure things out. And when we rigorously try to figure things out, sometimes we're offensive, sometimes people don't like what we say, but sometimes that's just too goddamn bad. It just sucks. Like, and she's a perfect example of that in that interview, because she's just completely caught. She's like, well, shit, yeah, you're right. You're right. So, wow. So to close this off, there's a lot more to watch. I will link to the full interview below, but wow, that was just, if you haven't seen the whole thing, I strongly recommend watching the full thing, because the whole discourse, the whole back and forth between them is just so indicative of so many political, ideological problems that have been floating around universities and in, like, public discourse, and it's just encapsulates those two sides, the two arguing sides, so well. And I think that the real great point about it is that the one side fails at the end, which is namely the sort of authoritarian, non-reasoned feminist. Like, great portrayal of women there too. Like, here you have this woman talking about gender equality and how valuable it is, etc., and she's a fucking disgrace. Like, she just, like, on the one hand, what she's doing is good, like Peterson said. She's digging into him, trying to figure it out, and she makes it overtly clear, gives him the opportunity to say his position exactly what it is, so that there's no, misunderstanding. But just, it's the degree to which she just can't quite grasp some of that stuff that he's saying is just, oh. So, yes, so that is my analysis. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to see more content like this, please subscribe to my channel. Or don't, but whatever.